Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we conclude a 5-day program on the pandemic and a reexamination and reevaluation of the vaccines that were mandated by the United States, by virtually all European governments and governments around the world, to the catastrophic detriment to public health, to civil liberties, and to people's faith in the medical profession in very, very profound ways. I want to first just acknowledge that we're still broadcasting. As I said on Monday, 5 days ago, we were unsure as to whether the algorithms were going to shut us down because the conversation that we've had over the last 5 days would not have been allowed a year ago, 2 years ago, maybe even 6 months ago. But because of the election of Donald Trump and the fact that Robert Kennedy Jr. is now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, other distinguished individuals are now at the head of the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control. It looks like there is now the opportunity that we've not had since 2020 when the pandemic was declared and everybody was forced into lockdown and isolation, and there was a repression on social media of any kind of dissent. We now have the opportunity to do what democracies can and should do, and that is have open public dialogue about matters that pertain to the public interest. And if there's any issue that pertains to the public interest, it's what happened to the world during the pandemic. And so we are very pleased that we're still on the air and that civic virtue is beginning to reemerge around this very seminal issue that in some ways transformed the world more indelibly than virtually any other public event that I can think of in my lifetime. And I want to underscore that as we conclude. You know, when one thinks of the war in Ukraine or even what's going on in the Middle East or other major events that have taken place, the Arab Spring back in 2014, the Occupy movement, the Vietnam War, the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan. I just think of major events of our time. For most of us, we watched it on the news, and we may have had very strong opinions about it, but at no time was there the repression of free speech like there was around that singular event of the pandemic that affected everybody because everybody was under lockdown. Everybody was in isolation. Everybody was mandated to get the vaccines. And to not get them took a remarkable act of courage. And so our opportunity now to assess is a very important moment because we're dealing with an event that affected us all and directly affected through deleterious effects from the vaccines many, many people that we all know. So this has been Humanity Rising at its best, being on the cutting edge, being courageous enough to tackle some of the really gnarly, complicated, controversial issues of our time. And it's in that spirit that I thank all of you for joining us here today on Humanity Rising. It's an important moment for our democracy. In this spirit, we want to conclude our program with a Vermont farmer, author, and attorney, John Klar, who was singularly motivated by the COVID vaccines that were administered to children. Something, as you all know, that is now in the required vaccine list for every child in America. My grandson is holding it off, but this is an issue, everyone, that affects every child in the United States and children in other countries around the world. So John Klar has been a champion of this cause that has gone all the way under his aegis to the Supreme Court of the United States. So John, we want to welcome you to Humanity Rising, and thank you for your service. And I think the way we would like to begin, John, with any comments you'd like to make about my introduction, and then take us into your journey and how you, as a Vermont farmer, probably at that time just minding his own business, got into this domain, and then we'll dialogue from there. But thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm honored. It's such an important issue, and I'm so glad for voices like yours that are speaking up and now are allowed to speak up instead of just being a tree falling in the wilderness with no access to the media. And great intro. Let me applaud your intro. But no joking there. It was a great segue into what we're discussing, and you reminded me of what Mary Holland said on your show about having lived in the Soviet Union under a repressive regime and how much it seems like that's what we lived under. And for my part, a little background, I was a practicing attorney for a number of years in Connecticut, and then I got sick with Lyme disease and I moved to Vermont, and that's where I was farming for the next 20 years. And when this all started, I was actually running for governor in Vermont, which was really not about winning because I was running against Phil Scott, the most popular governor in the country at the time and probably still. But I was running with a group of people to try to highlight certain issues. This state is it's really almost like a uniparty, I call it. And in the course of that, COVID struck and it interfered with my ability to campaign. And I didn't know quite what to do. Now, because of my illness with Lyme, I became rather skeptical of physicians because all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't seem to fix me. And through farming, I learned a lot about animals and immunity. And in talking to my doctor, I never took a flu vaccine because I came to the realization that natural immunity was probably better than taking a flu vaccine that's a hit or miss anyway. And so, but I wasn't what we would call anti-vax by any means. And in the course of this campaign and this new scourge, I had to make decisions. Ultimately, I made a decision not to take the vaccine. My wife was working on the front lines as an RN here in Vermont. And she was a hero, you know. Our healthcare workers were just great heroes until she wouldn't take the vaccine. And that's its own story about medical exemptions, religious exemptions that are being pulled away right now, even in the face of a measles scare, which brings us up to where we are now.
Hmm.
So I'm a writer, and I write for various outlets, and one is American Thinker. So early in the COVID affair, we might call it, I wrote a piece about why mandatory vaccines were unconstitutional. And I noticed pretty quickly that I was being compromised or shadow banned. I did a video on YouTube where I discussed the data related to the vaccines, and I was threatened to be banned by YouTube, and I retaliated, and I said, everything I just used was off the CDC's website, and they relented. I turned to things like at one point I did a video of myself mixing mortar cement. And I told people, now don't think that if you're wearing a mask, that this particulate matter that you see floating in the air right now, that you'll be protected because it'll get around your mask. These physical particles will actually, a mask will not protect you. That was a way I tried to, bypass the gaslighting and really the deplatforming and the silencing. And then when they talked about you couldn't use hydroxychloroquine because that was going to kill you, and I'd been on it for about 8 or 10 years along with antibiotics trying to treat Lyme disease, I knew they were lying about that as well. I studied microbiology in high school and college. I understand how viruses work. Anthony Fauci said it was just like measles. Anyone who understands the virus and how different that is from measles, he subsequently retracted that outrageous statement. But the whole safe and effective thing quickly became obviously not true. And in fact, I wrote another article for American Thinker at a point where Vermont had the highest vaccination rates in the country, good for us, and the highest infection rates at the same time. I'm still not aware that I've had COVID. A couple of times I was sick during that ordeal, and I was tested. So to the extent we can rely on the tests, I was tested negative. But I've never been vaccinated. Now, like with flu, if I'm healthy, and I do get the disease, I'm probably more likely to develop natural immunity. And then the other thing was the whole gain of function.
Mm.
Vanity Fair, the Wall Street Journal, and others came out with the evidence pretty early on that this was most likely the consequence of a man-made American taxpayer paid for campaign to develop diseases for biowarfare, but we're told it's to prevent that. And of course, this is pretty obvious probably to most of your viewers and listeners that it's a nefarious program. Now, of course, if it came out that the disease escaped from a lab in Wuhan, let alone was deliberately released, but I think more likely escaped, well, that would destroy billions and billions of dollars of investment in the entire research area of bio research and virology would be destroyed. So it was either this salvific rescue for us or it was the villain. And I think more Americans have come to understand through this ordeal that it was the villain. And I hope that with this new administration, as you mentioned in your intro, it seems like we dodged a bullet. We actually can have this conversation, even if we are conspiracy theorists, by the way, because how else would you ever uncover conspiracies? And so fast forward then, so I don't practice law. I still struggle with fibromyalgia, it's called, which I was an offshoot of the Lyme disease, apparently, and I've been struggling with it since. And actually, I've found good, healthy food and organic diet, avoiding all processed foods, sleeping well, staying hydrated, exercising regularly, which is why I still keep sheep and cows, not in sizable numbers, but also so that I can afford grass-fed meats. All of these things are fueling my body's natural immunity. And the
Right.
more we look for pharmaceutical interventions, or I want to take a pill so I won't weigh 700 pounds anymore. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, you got to get on the Stairmaster. You've got to eat less, pork rinds and potato chips. And, I've certainly had to make those individual decisions. And
Right.
so into the mix of this, the Paulatella case comes out. And I should clarify that I was not involved at the trial level with the case. In Vermont, we do not have an appellate court. It's a small state. So you go to trial court in the state. And if you lose and want to appeal, then you go directly to the Vermont Supreme Court. So the first time I heard about this decision was back in August of last year. And when I read it, I was just horrified. I said, this is the most abhorrent, absurd decision I've ever read. And my background happens to include preemption law, federal preemption law. That is, when a federal statute preempts or overrides or supersedes state law. And so I immediately thought this is a total misapplication of preemption doctrine. It's a horrible outcome, and it will allow schools to administer vaccines, certainly COVID interventions, as they're called, with total impunity, even if they did so maliciously, or like, oh, those parents don't want to wear a mask and now they don't want a vaccine. I'll jab them.
Mhm.
And I've been attacked
Tell
in the
us,
national.
tell us
Sorry, yes.
what happened. Tell us the.
Yes, sir. Yes. So the Paulatella family. So I was how I got involved in was I called their lawyer and I said, "Hey, this is a terrible case. Could you use some help?" And
Mm.
Ron Ferrara is his name, and he said, "Yes, please," which often you won't find. He's not admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court. He never expected this to be this intervention, we'll call it, of federal law and the PrEP Act to be used to close the door on his clients. And so then I got to meet the Paulatella family. They're a wonderful Christian family. They're an older couple, particularly the father is I think 71, and their 6-year-old child. They had him in school. They were not anti-vax, but it was announced that there was going to be a program at the school, a clinic to administer COVID vaccines at the school. This is a Vermont public school. Now, as I had been talking about, by the way, just an interjection, according to the CDC's own data throughout, this disease is really not of a high risk to minor children unless they have underlying medical conditions. So I'm still absolutely aghast that they would require or recommend a COVID vaccine for a minor child that's not otherwise at high risk. And so into that situation, the family, the father and mother talked. They said, well, this is an experimental vaccine. Shu Jen, the mother, is an immigrant from Taiwan, and her English is, I think, great, but she's self-conscious about it. But she says, I didn't understand. She's very soft-spoken. We have a video with her. Well, if it's experimental, maybe we wait, she said. So Tony, the father, actually went into the school 2 days before the clinic and went to the vice principal and said, hey, I can keep our son Leo home. They've allowed me to use his name. I've met him. Awesome people. And oh no, you don't have to keep him home. He won't be vaccinated. Bring him in, it'll be fine. So they bring him to school like any other day. He is taken from his classroom, given and despite his protests and saying, "No, I'm not supposed to get vaccinated. Mom and dad told me I'm not supposed to get vaccinated." They take him out of his class. They put a name tag on him for another child in another grade, and they take him to the clinic. They administer the shot. He's crying out, "No, no, I'm not supposed to get a shot." Apparently, one of his prior physicians, a pediatrician, was there administering the clinic. Should have known the child, perhaps. They distract him with a toy. They give him the shot. He goes home and he says, Mom, I'm so sorry, because he was traumatized because he felt like he had failed his parents. And
Mm,
his mom at first didn't think
mm,
he could be, correct. And then she saw the bandage on him, from where they had given him the shot. So she then went into the school to say what happened. And this was sort of a second injury because the school treated her like she was annoying. She said she felt horribly mistreated. They couldn't tell her how it happened or who was responsible. They immediately took the child out of school, which for them meant putting him in a private school, which meant Tony going back to work. Instead of retiring in his 70s, he's now working. I believe he was working in road construction. I think he took a new job. I think he might be doing that or trucking. And so this was life changing for them, but so much were they just shocked. And she breaks down in tears telling the story. So this is adding insult to injury. The third shock came when the court system said, "Oh, sorry, you can't sue for battery. You can't sue for the breach of fiduciary duties by these officials. You can't find out how it happened. You can't interview or cross-examine or conduct depositions against Doe
oh,
number one and Doe number two and Doe number three to even find out how this happened." And so I agreed. I told Ron, I said, look, you could probably do better than me, but if we can't, I will help you find a lawyer to take this case to the U.S. Supreme Court. This case has to be challenged. And I approached several national organizations, but there are other cases coming up that they're involved in. They're all great lawyers, and nobody was going to take it pro bono. So I agreed to do it, and if nothing else, to tell their story. And so we filed the brief with the U.S. Supreme Court. It was just denied last week, or declined, refused. There are about 8,000 of these filed a year of writs of petitions for writ of certiorari. So we knew that the odds were long, but kind of like running for governor, even though I knew I couldn't win, it's important to get our voices out there, to educate the public,
exactly.
to reach the court of public opinion if we cannot reach a court of our peers. And I think we did that a lot. And I'm not sure if you're aware that Maine just came out with a case 2 days ago with almost identical facts to our Paulatella decision. It's the Hogan case. And if you think it's worth pursuing, because I think it is legally, I can explain how that
Please,
case
please do.
differs. Well, so first let me explain. I realize we don't have maybe all lawyers here, so let me explain a little bit more about how preemption works. And I'll use an analogy which I like to use because I think it's helpful for lay people to understand. For years, for years, people started to understand that maybe cigarettes weren't good for you to smoke. There's an interesting parallel here, I think, to vaccines. And yet the tobacco companies said, oh no, they're great for you. No, no. In fact, they had advertising of doctors telling you how healthy it was. And I smoke Cools because they're so good for my lungs. And athletes, star athletes coming out in TV ads going, oh man, these things, I jump higher. I'm so healthy. Cigarettes will really up your game. Literally, people don't imagine that this could ever happen in America. And if they look at their tobacco companies, they might want to look at similar profit driven motives in big pharma and big food. Big food will tell you that their foods are good for you, even though they're waste products recycled from the trash bin. So Congress in, I think, 1962 passed a federal labeling requirement for cigarettes. Everybody knows it. Warning, smoking cigarettes may be hazardous to your health. Talk about an understatement. What people don't realize is for almost 30 years after that, anytime someone who had cancer or died from tobacco smoking, who tried to bring a lawsuit against the big tobacco companies, they were met with a preemption defense. And basically, the defense attorney said, oh no, if you allow these people to sue under this, against tobacco companies for the death caused by smoking cigarettes, well, that might suggest that that label on the tobacco packaging, which says maybe hazardous, is not enough. So, for instance, if somebody won in North Carolina, that state might then require you or the tobacco company, in order to insulate itself from liability in North Carolina, might have to put a more stringent warning on its tobacco package. And that would interfere with Congress's plan to have tobacco product labeling. And therefore, it is preempted by federal law. And they throw out the
Ah,
cases, case after
gotcha.
case after case. Now, this is called implied preemption. There are two kinds of federal preemption, or more than two, but two main categories. One is express preemption, where Congress says, we're going to regulate this. And in fact, they had regulated the labeling of cigarettes. Did they regulate the prosecution of civil lawsuits on behalf of families and their members who had died? No, they didn't. So the courts implied that. And in the late 80s, I think it was 1989, I think it was called SIP alone, the US Supreme Court finally overturned that and said, no, you may proceed with your lawsuits to prove that you died from smoking cigarettes without regard to the labeling. Now, again, think about this, because there's an analogy here to Paulatella and what we're dealing with vaccines. Did Congress intend to close the door on people's lawsuits? No, of course not. And what we found in the subsequent lawsuits was that the tobacco companies have been actively lying about their products and their illnesses, that they were much more deadly, that they knew it was deadly,
They
that
knew
they
it.
tried to increase the amount of nicotine, that they would create light versions of their cigarettes were actually more toxic, kind of like diet soda will make you fatter and give you cancer and all kinds of other illnesses. So now let's carry over to what's happened under the PrEP Act, because as Mary Holland, I know, discussed it with you, how that evolved. So what the PrEP Act says was, hey, if the federal government, if it authorizes the use in an emergency of a vaccine, and it is administered pursuant to that decree by the government, then nobody can sue the manufacturer for harms caused by that vaccine. Now, what happened to the Paulatella family and then the Hogan family in Maine and other families around the country? This has happened, and part of the story here, by the way, is after we came out with this case, we were contacted with other people who this happened to in Vermont. So this isn't over, I can tell you, because it needs to be stopped.
By the
And
way, did anything happen of a deleterious nature to the child, to the little boy?
not yet. Not
Okay.
yet. We don't know. I mean, it depends on how
Good.
much you trust. Maybe it was, but it's really not relevant, because
Yeah. Yeah.
to
No, I
jab
agree.
somebody with anything, to put a needle in their arm is a battery. There was a battery claim here. To give some other, like an HPV vaccine, which are done in Vermont just without parental consent. Whether or not there's injury, does that, physical injury, does that violate the parent's duty as well as right to oversee the medical care of their child? Does it violate long-standing constitutional protections of something called informed consent, which the PrEP Act has a lot of language about, that the companies are still bound to design defects or to mislabeling and to informed consent. But that all gets bypassed by Vermont Supreme Court, because what the argument was is that, hey, if the PrEP Act protects anybody who's giving a vaccine for anything they do, right? I don't know. I actually raised a question in one of my articles. Well, what if they molested the child while administering the vaccine? Would that be covered? Now, notice here, Jim, the Paulatellas did not file suit against a pharmaceutical company like all of those tobacco cases where they were suing R.J. Reynolds, right? They sued the school only, not for harm caused by the vaccine or its contents, which is what the PrEP Act was meant to create insulation for,
Mm,
but for the violation of the rights and or the
exactly.
duties to the children in the school to act competently and not negligently, or we never know, deliberately. And so this seemed to be an even more egregious misuse of of implied preemption, because the court is there's nowhere in the PrEP Act that it says we're going to exterminate parental rights and patient informed consent, which the two go together because a child can't form informed consent. And so that's why I just felt the case was just egregious and it had to be appealed. Now we know what the odds are, and we know also that for the Supreme Court to hear a case like this, probably we would need another similar case, maybe in the other direction, coming up from another state for the court to have to take up a case from a state court as opposed to from federal courts. Because there are a lot of cases in line to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Out of about 8,000 a year, they grant about 100. So that's why Hogan, the main case, and other cases coming up, and why our case still set the stage. Now, Paulatella is not binding on states other than Vermont, and parents here who are aggrieved by other medical interventions still have their common law rights, and that's what we will be looking at. But this is an abuse of implied preemption. The court really went to great calisthenics to do this, and we saw that more in the Hogan case. And so if I've explained this well, then what people understand is that what the Vermont Supreme Court did was said, you can only have recourse for this injury to your child by this school official or these doctors or whoever was the Jane and John Does, because we don't even have their names. They've been protected by Vermont's Attorney General, who has been there fighting not for the parents or the children, but for the school system. Okay, to me, that's a conflict of interest. Your only recourse is under the Federal PrEP Act. And the only way you can recover under the Federal PrEP Act is if it's a willful administration of a vaccine that causes death or serious bodily injury. Now, if you have traditional rights like for punitive damages for a battery, if somebody punches your child so they can give them a vaccine, no, I guess you can't sue now, can you? Where's the line? The court has made no distinction. It literally threw out a battery claim. Emotional distress. My 6-year-old client and his mother in tears over and over, feeling they had failed one another. That normally would be something that people could seek recourse for. And this family wasn't out for money, by the way. No, the child was not physically harmed, but they didn't want this to happen to another child
Exactly.
and family. And they are real troopers to stand up the way they have. I mean, I'm so honored to
Mm,
represent people with that kind of caliber and character. And that's why, even though this case is only binding in Vermont, it was already used as a precedent to support an almost identical fact scenario in Maine that just came out 3 days ago. It will be used in other state courts, perhaps, or federal courts to do the same thing to other families and say, oh, no, no, Big Pharma has immunity. And therefore, even if you didn't sue Big Pharma, your school has immunity too. It trickles down. It's a trickle down theory of sorts. And so it's encompassing all kinds of activities that Congress did not, by its terms, discuss. There's no legislative history discussing terminating or extinguishing parental rights or protecting people who are bad actors in schools. And it's a horrible moral hazard because it tells school officials that they can do what they want with impunity as long as it's an experimental jab. The Vermont court acknowledged,
let me,
even if it were an experimental vaccine, too bad for you, bye.
yeah,
Sorry.
let's pause there for a moment because I think the point that you're making is so important. Now, if I understand it correctly, on virtually any other issue pertaining to one's child or children in school, parental sovereignty is honored. If you don't want them to play basketball or, they have something and they need to have a special program or exemption and so forth and so on, except for the vaccines. I mean, it's my understanding that the coercive uh, enforcement of the mandate is virtually unique to the vaccines. Is that correct or is that not correct?
Well, yes and no. Nationwide, that's absolutely correct. And historically, that's correct. When you live in an ultra liberal jurisdiction like Vermont, which has gone full woke and had a constitutional amendment to protect transgender identifying minor children who flee here from being protected, uh, are literally shielded by our authorities. And Vermont has a statute which protects medical care advisor personnel if they administer puberty blockers or hormones to minor children. And Vermont does this without parental consent. They administer HPV vaccines and birth control methods to children without parental consent. They have
Really?
separate medical records for
Oh,
minor children that they keep from the parents. They hide they're changed in names if they think the parents are not supportive of transgender transitioning. And teachers and coaches have to call the children two different names. And if the parents are in for a conference or they're at a public game, they have to dead name them, if you know what I mean by that. They have to use their given birth name. And that's actually why the Vermont Attorney General and the Vermont Supreme Court and our government, Governor Scott, was awarding cash bonuses to schools based on the rates of vaccination of children in this school when this happened. That to me is a conflict of interest. Giving cash to pharmacies and doctors to administer COVID vaccines, that's a little bit of a conflict of interest, I think. And so they're going to wish they never did this because I'm about to launch a radio campaign here in Vermont to ask parents whose children have been given any of these other vaccines or interventions or puberty blockers to contact lawyers that I will connect them with. I'm doing this all pro bono, so it's not for profit, and they can't come after me because I'm not admitted in Vermont. I'm admitted still in Connecticut and the U.S. Supreme Court. And so, in answer to your question, that's the way it should be. That's the way. Well, frankly, it shouldn't even be that there's exemption for the in the Federal PrEP Act, but it should be that all other state causative
yeah.
action remain intact. But they too are under pressure, and now the measles vaccine is being used in more states. I think Hawaii now is pending it to remove the religious exemption for all vaccines recommended. So at what point do we all pull our children out of public schools because we can no longer trust them or the vaccines or the people administering them or the courts to protect us from the aforementioned list? I hope that answers your question, Jim.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary.
And it's
Extraordinary.
true. And it's extraordinary. And that's why what you're doing is important because we need people to be educated. If people are informed, we can have that feedback loop that Mary
Now,
Holland talks about. We can have accountability in our legislators who are being paid money in donations at the state and federal level. And pharmaceutical companies through user fees are basically paying for the staff of people authorizing these vaccines. And the more I look at even the measles outbreak right now, I see lies all around me. And
yeah,
that has
yeah,
made me
for sure.
more and more distrust what's happening. And they're
Well, let's
mocking Bobby Kennedy for cod liver oil when the CDC agrees that vitamin A and B is a good intervention once you have measles. And they're just turning everything around in fear. So, yes, go ahead. Sorry. I
yeah.
get carried away.
Well, no, no, this is so fascinating. I want to continue with the vaccine issue, but I'm astonished at what you were saying about schools administering puberty blockers and keeping around the transgender issue and keeping that information from parents. How does that happen?
It happens in the Green Mountain State because we have a uniparty. We don't have a voice. We literally, the governor's vetoes are routinely overridden. We did gain some seats in 2024. It happens when I ran for office, people said I was a liar for saying this. They were saying you're making it up. I'm like, no, here's the statute. Here are the parents. I've been dealing with these parents who come to me behind the scenes for years and what's been done to their children behind their backs. I know of a mother who was called into school and said, if you do not agree that your son is a girl and call him by his girl name, you will not have a son anymore. This is by a public school guidance counselor. In another case, when the parents realized what was happening with their child, they had supported her when she said she was gay. They supported her when she said she was trans. But when they found she was self-harming and studying satanic materials and having sex with another transgender student in the school under the stairwell, and then they saw the self-harm, they took her to the ER. And when they said that's enough, you're not going to wear a chest binder, the medical professionals called the Department of Children and Youth Services against the parents They fled the state. They're in Connecticut now. They have told me I can tell their story. These are real stories. These are minor children. These are at this point 14 or 15 years old, but it had started earlier. I know of case after case after case, and it's going to come out. So, yes, that is what is happening in Vermont. And they hide it because they know it's evil and that if it's dragged out in the light, it's going to melt like a vampire. And my goal is to drag it out in the light and have some accountability. And Donald Trump has now said, we're not supporting transgender sports. We're not going to support transgender education in schools anymore. And guess what? That's where they get some of their money. Vermont has some of the highest, the most expensive per pupil costs in the country. When adjusted for income, it's number 2 in the country, because we're not a rich state. We spend more and more on children, and we're getting lower and lower test scores. A lot of it is because of these things that are being done in the schools as part of an ideological indoctrination, and that includes surgeries and interventions. And I was shocked because as a lawyer, I researched this. I've written articles about it for years now. You could go to the University of Vermont Medical Center, and they've now taken it down, I think, because of my articles. And there are forms for children to sign, informed consent forms about all the risks of gender hormone interventions, particularly the drugs. They can cause fatty liver disease. You're going to grow hair on your face. You're going to be sterile for life. You could get cancer. We don't know. There are no long-term studies. They say there are no long-term studies. And neither of these forms, by the way, because there was one for if you're going to become a boy becoming a girl, there's another form, a separate form, if you're a girl going to become a boy, and almost suggesting a bi-gender informed consent scenario. There wasn't even a signature for the parent to sign. And by the way, the studies show that even for transgender children, having their parents involved is the most important thing for their mental health and to prevent suicide. So all of this is a government apparatus, highly funded, by the way. A lot of money coming in from out of state. Vermont has a huge bio research development in Burlington. You can get a lot of money figuring out how to splice the DNA of a frog with a walnut. Almost literally. I think there actually are some similar cases out there. Um, Pork with soy, I think, in the UK. But what about dealing with the fundamental issues of children's health and getting real science about the impact
Exactly.
of these
Exactly.
hormones and surgeries long term? I don't believe they do physical surgical interventions for children under 18. I think actually they can do emancipated minors, I believe, can in Vermont, 16 and 17. I believe. I'd have to check on that. But these drugs are being administered, and it's time that we find the parents this has happened to and restore their not longstanding
Absolutely.
liberties. These are fundamental rights that, and again, duties. Who's going to bear the cost when the child suffers injury? The parents do. And so the state needs to be held accountable. And I don't think their statute shielding medical personnel from doing this is going to hold up.
Mhm.
It's unconstitutional. And that's how you strike down a statute because the U.S. the U.S. Constitution is under the Supremacy Clause, the supreme law of the land.
Yeah.
And that's what's been derogated back to Paulatella. If I could move on and tell you about Hogan, because
Yeah.
I think that's really important to understand. What struck me as equally shocking about the Vermont Supreme Court's Paulatella decision was after determining I believe absolutely erroneously that the Federal PrEP Act preempts all of these state tort laws, these traditional state case law, opportunities, particularly battery, because that's an intentional tort. By the way, all the rest are based on negligence. A battery is an intentional tort in meaning you did it on purpose and you don't have to prove intent. Okay. Similar to statutory rape. You don't have to prove you knew the child was 12. Otherwise, everybody could get away with it. So you don't have to prove intent. It's a strict liability situation. So battery is an intentional tort and it's been blocked. Well, if in fact the Federal PrEP Act preempts these state causes of action in all 50 states, according to this interpretation, if it were affirmed by the federal courts, then the next line of inquiry, a natural line of inquiry is, well, then, is the Federal PrEP Act unconstitutional? Does it diminish or derogate or inflict or impinge upon traditional rights, particularly the parental consent laws or parental consent rights? They're more than just laws, they're ingrained in our constitutional law. or the right to bodily integrity. Bodily integrity, people may have heard that before in the abortion realm. Okay, the idea that you're my body, my choice. Does that not extend to vaccines, experimental vaccines in 6-year-olds without parental consent? Yeah, it should. So Vermont's court, though, to my shock, never addressed this. It just says, "Oh, sorry, this is federal law. Go away now. Your only recourse is if you die or have serious bodily injury. You can't sue on all these other things. We're going to side with the school officials who can do whatever they want with impunity." Well, the
Whoa.
main court in Hogan actually took up that mantle. The plaintiffs, their lawyers said, "Hey, what about bodily integrity? What about parental rights?" And in a footnote, footnote 3 or 4, this court basically um, it says, yes, these are fundamental rights, and this is why they don't apply. And then manipulates Jacobson, which it may be known as a 1905 decision about smallpox vaccine, to say that the government has a compelling governmental interest to stop pandemics or epidemics, and therefore your personal rights get thrown out the window. Well, there are two problems with that. One is Jacobson involved smallpox vaccine, and the Jacobson court in 1905, if you read it, went to a very exhaustive discussion of why the vaccines were highly effective, highly approved in the medical community, had been fully tested. There was no science that the plaintiff was showing to question their efficacy or safety. Okay, that was not undertaken by the main court. That was not undertaken at all, this analysis at all, by the Vermont court. But further, Jacobson didn't say that the government could force jab you. Jacobson said, if you don't take this vaccine, Mr. Jacobson, you're going to have to pay a $5 fine in the state of Massachusetts, which is presumably what he did in 1905. That was a lot of money. So even Jacobson does not stand for the proposition that the government ever has the ability to mandatorily vaccinate you.
Mm,
And
mm.
as a Vermont, excuse me, Ninth Circuit decision, which just got set on hold, is going to be reheard, United Healthcare, I believe it's called. They decided that Jacobson did not apply because to COVID vaccines, because it was used there in that case, because Jacobson applied to a vaccine that prevented infection to other people. And you can't prove, part of the allegations here is that this COVID vaccine does not work as advertised. It does not prevent infection to other people. In fact, people are still getting sick who have had this. This should be a question of fact. It was in 1905. Now we've progressed and matured to 2025, where we don't have that constitutional inquiry anymore.
Exactly.
And so that, I believe, is something that the main court sidestepped. And the main court also, and the trial court in the California case, tried to apply what's called a rational basis test through Jacobson. Jacobson applied a rational relationship test. If the government's intervention is rationally related to a reasonable goal, then it's constitutional. And so they're saying, well, this is okay because it passed Jacobson. Well, since Jacobson, we have what's called strict scrutiny, which means that the government, if the government does anything if it doesn't impact your constitutional rights, get lost. It's not important. But if it does, if it's your right to speech, your right to bodily integrity, et cetera, okay, we heighten the scrutiny. It's called strict scrutiny. And it requires the burden shifts to the government to show a compelling governmental interest, which is achieved through narrow means using the least restrictive means possible. And the main court in the Hogan decision concluded that therefore the child there, very similarly to our case, was vaccinated without parental consent, no death or serious injury, no other recourse, but state law claims, includes a battery claim. All those get thrown out because the court invokes Jacobson and says, well, it's clear you can mandate vaccines under Jacobson, and that's a compelling state interest. Well, is it the least restrictive means? Because if you look at the decision isn't actually really deciding that the government can impose a mandatory vaccine and you can't complain about it, because it wasn't a mandatory vaccine in either Vermont or Maine. It was an optional vaccine. You took away the option, and you're now using the
Right.
Jacobson decision not to further a compelling governmental interest. You're furthering the interest of protecting wrong actors for breaching their duties to children. That wasn't Congress's intention. That wasn't what Jacobson held. And that's not a correct application of strict scrutiny analysis. it's an obscene case, but what Hogan has done is stuck the head out further. It's time to play whack-a-mole. Vermont ignored these constitutional liberties, and the Maine Supreme Court has come out and used a contortionist couldn't twist themselves the way this court did
Exactly.
to throw
Exactly.
out our liberties. And I hope everybody understands and that I've done a decent job of explaining these complex issues so that people can just with comment, a child, a 6-year-old, can pretty much comprehend what I'm saying. And so this is a crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. And since we're tracking that, I'd love for you to tell what happened to your wife, because that's another example of egregious abridgments of civil liberties and civil rights. Tell us what happened to her.
Well, and I do want to preface this by saying I think the tides have changed when they've lost so many nurses. My wife was a cardiology nurse at the time, very good one. In fact, she pointed out that myocarditis was appearing in patients, and she was poo-pooed and and disrespected. So she was a hero on the front lines. My daughter as well, an EMT at the time, driving around with these little inadequate paper masks and being told how heroic they were. And they were heroic because at that time we didn't really know whether gain of function or not what the mortality rate of this disease was. News coming out of Italy and other places was saying it had a 10% mortality rate. My great grandmother here in Vermont died during the Spanish flu pandemic. That was a very profound experience for my grandmother, who was 10 at the time, and they were hand milking cows. So we took it seriously. But my wife stayed there in the front lines, being around patients every day, full time. And actually, people that took leave got more money than she did going in because they got both partial pay and benefits. So it was really quite a slap in the face. So now the vaccines came out, and Jackie, who had taken a flu vaccine the previous year as a requirement for the job, had suffered a rather, and this is relevant, so had suffered quite an immune system response, swollen glands, and other. She'd been going to the doctor, and she went to a homeopathic doctor and said, "Don't take any more flu vaccines. Clearly, your body didn't, reject it against this." And so now she has to take the mRNA vaccine as well. Now, in the meantime, everybody else in the hospital got these vaccines. And if you don't get it, well, you're anti-vaxxer, you're going to make us sick. Well, if your vaccine works, you're not going to make us sick. And she had to wear extra protocols, so she wasn't going to kill anybody because their vaccines work so well. But she was really treated socially horribly. At one point, a doctor inappropriately chastised her for not being vaccinated in front of other people in a blatant violation of HIPAA. And as a lawyer husband, I tell you, we could have sued. There's an automatic $10,000 fine for that. But we're not out to fight with anybody. But just the whole frenzy of it, the fear frenzy at the time. But Jackie stood her guns and she refused.
Good
And
for her.
then they gave her a religious exemption for the mRNA vaccine, but they denied her a medical exemption for the flu vaccine. And she left. She had some medical issues at the time with her neck in particular. She was suffering a lot of chronic neck trouble.
Well,
And
Wayne Rhodey yesterday said there's been more injuries from the flu vaccine than even the COVID vaccines. I was astonished
I,
to hear that.
I believe it. I wonder if there have been more injuries from the measles vaccines than there have been from measles, if we really got
I'm
real
sure.
evidence out of
I'm sure.
the vaccine adverse event reporting system, which is skewed towards, oh no, well that wasn't a measles vaccine death, that was SIDS, or we don't really have enough evidence. If you look at it,
Exactly.
they skew all the evidence in these proceedings to dismiss as many cases as they can without doing any kind of real analysis. And as Mary Holland has pointed out, you don't have any opportunity to do discovery. But you see the opposite right now in the measles cases. You see, oh, gee, they died of measles. You could get shot in a gang war and have died from COVID-19, you may remember. And now they're doing similar things. They're jumping to conclusions. So everything is again, it's fear mongering. And so looking at how they're treating the measles outbreak right now and how they're attacking Bobby Kennedy, saying he minimalized it when he says these are not uncommon, they're not uncommon, and how they won't look at the possibility that millions of people that are coming into the country unvetted might be carrying diseases. Heaven forbid, that means you're a racist. No, no, it's the unvaxxed people. It's these parents that won't do what the government says they must do. It's draconian. I won't even get a tetanus shot now. I so distrust because I wasn't anti-vax. I am now. I don't trust them anymore. I'll go out. I've got chickens. I will kiss a chicken before I get a bird flu vaccine. My cows, I have cows. My cow pick all the pictures for a year now. I'm a farmer. They're coming after our food supply, by the way. All the pictures about bird flu always have a picture of cows. Cows aren't dying of bird flu. Bird flu is in the geese and the ducks flying over my head. Everybody's afraid of the climate, afraid of the disease. You need good bacteria to live. And part of the problem with masking was it actually suppressed your natural immune system. Plus, these masks were full of all kinds of toxic chemicals.
Totally.
Those are maybe the unseen threat that we should be more concerned about if we want to stem long-term disease. But sorry, rant over. I'm just tying it into me.
No, though this is fascinating because you're connecting a lot of dots, John. And
I hope so.
let's segue just because I want to keep your encyclopedic knowledge going. When you say that they're attacking our food supply too, you're a farmer. Tell us about your experience in that domain, because what the ultimate point is that what happened with COVID is not unique. It's a
Correct.
symptom of a larger governmental encroachment on personal liberties and in the attempt to standardize a control mechanism that serves corporate and political interests that are contrary to what the individuals have in mind, so that they're violating parental rights with their children. They're violating the rights of people who are gainfully employed as nurses. And so tell us about your experience in terms of the encroachments on the integrity of the food supply.
And they're violating all of our rights to free speech. You put it very nicely. I'll just be a little more blunt, and we can call me a conspiracy
Please
theorist.
do.
Well, after the conspiracy comes through, you could drop the conspiracy theorist. So, fear, Orwell, 1984, is used for government to uh, demand compliance by sheep proles. Now, I didn't know any of this. It's a gift that I got sick with Lyme disease. It brought me to my faith as well. I'm actually a pastor now as well. And if you knew me in my life, I had no faith at all. But sickness brought me to look up, you know.
Good for
And
you.
but I learned, and it's a gift, you know, even though I struggle physically, spiritually, and mentally, I'm much happier, I think. But I learned how to farm, and I didn't get into it with any conspiracy theories. But what I learned farming, the more I raised animals, and we made cheeses, artisanal raw milk cheeses. Oh, gee, it's illegal to sell cheese unless it's aged for 60 days. Well, why is that? They don't do that in France. Oh, gee, I have to comply with this law and that law. And now you are going to come in and shut down on-farm slaughter. So one of the things we do in Vermont, and my family's done it for 100 years here, is we slaughter the animals on farm. If you're going to eat meat, the most humane way to do it is to have the animal die right where it was born. They never know what's coming. And Vermont tried to ban that. And so I, as a lawyer, I said to my wife, Jackie, I said, this was in 2016. I said, you know, lawyers or farmers can't afford lawyers, and lawyers wouldn't understand farming. I'm going to complain about this. So I entered into civil disobedience and I challenged them to come arrest me. And I announced that I was going to keep selling halves of beef and selling lambs on farm slaughtered. And we managed to defeat that bill. We still are allowed to do that legally in Vermont. But the point of this
Now,
story
why
is,
did they want to stop that? What was their rationale?
well, always just like with vaccine, good question. Safety, safety. We're going to have more health and safety. Oh gosh, we had anthrax, so now we have to control you, like Mary Holland talked about with
Yeah.
with the PrEP Act. Oh well, we had 4 cases of E. coli, and therefore we need to control all animal production. Only most Americans don't know. When you see a 30,000-pound beef recall, that's voluntary. It'll say a voluntary beef recall because they don't actually have to do it. The big corporations fought with the U.S. government, and they get to decide what they recall. I'm not aware of a single person getting sick from a Vermont or local farm-raised animal. That doesn't happen. And the government can come in and shut you down. I can't even sell it unless it's USDA inspected by the cut. And we're trying to change that under the Prime Act that Thomas Massie has advanced. So the more I learned though, and then I discovered a guy named Wendell Berry. Some of you may have heard of Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry wrote in an essay in 1978 called Sanitation and the Small Farm, how in Kentucky at the time, they brought in all these new regulations to help food safety, and all it really did seem to do was shut down all the small farms. What I learned in our slaughter rules was that what happens is, and a guy named Dave Gumpert, who's a friend of mine and a writer, has written a book called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Food Rights. And I tracked it and looked at what he did and or what he showed us. And what's happened in Maine and Vermont, the battle against Amos Miller and raw milk, is that the federal government gives money to state and probably prompted by industries, that are consolidating our food, consolidating it vertically, consolidating it horizontally, crushing the small farms as they've been doing
Yes.
for a long time. We've lost our small farms. Our food comes from further and further away. It's more and more untrustworthy and toxic. And in fact, we're importing more and more of our food from places like China and Mexico and trusting their regulatory processes and that they're not putting pesticides on them that are banned here, though most of these pesticides are allowed in America because our FDA and EPA work for big corporate chemical manufacturers. That's the truth. That's what Bobby Kennedy has been telling people. That's MAHA. And so after I did this, I subsequently then wrote a book called Small Farm Republic, came out with Chelsea Green Publishing in 2023, advocating for conservatives, which I'd now become. I was a Democrat, Obama voter, saw Obama sell us out to Monsanto, sell us out to Wall Street, sell us out on GMO labeling laws and weakening what we passed here in Vermont. So I wrote a book and I said, basically, conservatives, why don't you take over the environmental movement? Because a big problem with conservatives is, well, they don't care about the environment. Well, no, you just don't agree with the climate change scenario, and that we should create solar panels and EV cars and heat pumps that generate ecotoxins in our water, in our air, in our bodies. Over 12,000 PFAs now identified by the EPA. Those are being generated like never before to go after carbon dioxide. All right. So even if we are warming the planet, this is the bad direction. Wendell Berry's written about it as well in his book, The Art of Loading Brush. So my book, Small Farm Republic, was about advocating for distributism, small farms instead of large, local, E.F. Schumacher, others, Thomas Jefferson. Okay, this is not a big idea. But the Green New Deal said, in order to save the planet, we have to consolidate all food production and everything that you do to prevent humans from destroying the planet. And now you have to eat bug burgers and you have to get rid of cows because cows are bad. And we have to, right now, the globalists at the WEF and the UN are doing this in Europe. Okay, and they're saying, oh no, we have to get rid of small farms in Holland. We have to get rid of small farmers in Ireland because
Yes.
they're creating carbon dioxide. And what we do need is more big farms, because big farms that use GMO crops that are dependent on glyphosate and pesticides and herbicides and fungicides that kill the soil and kill your body and kill the microbiome in your human gut. Well, that's the only way to protect us from climate change because they're more efficient. They're more efficient. We're back to Wendell Berry again. He was telling us this in the 60s, always in the name of efficiency. The real word is profits. Profits control.
Exactly.
1974, Kissinger report.
Exactly.
Control the people, control the food, control the people. If you read that report, it was generated with the CIA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and an organization called USAID. Okay, go read the Kissinger report if you haven't read it. Be horrified. It was secret for almost 20 years, and the fact that it was connected to USAID and the CIA was only revealed, I believe, in 2007. Because now I'm writing my next book. I just finished it. It's called Farm Hard or Starve. The blueprint for the modern globalist is laid out in Henry Kissinger's plan in 1974 to control global population, because he said at the time, everybody knows, scientists are showing us that the world is cooling rapidly and we're going to have frosted crops. Okay, the opposite of what they say now, that we're going to have more equity. But ultimately, if you read it, it's talking about compelled fertility, compelled sterilization in third world countries to keep them from breeding like rabbits, because that might create instability to prevent U.S. industrial interests from having access to foreign natural resources. Okay, that's our national security premise of the whole thing. Now, then we did that in Iraq. We took over all their organic food. We took over their seed bank in Abu Ghraib. We're now doing it in Ukraine. I just wrote a piece about it with Brownstone Institute. We're doing it through USAID. And if you read the Kissinger report, there's a whole section about how USAID can be used to spread propaganda, to persuade people, to shrink family size. So if you just explode that to bring that forward to Klaus Schwab, the NGOs, it's all laid out in Kissinger, that evil person's blueprint. We need NGOs. We need this. We need to control the world's landmass. We need to not have so many people. We need to put them in cities. The whole agenda 2030. It's real. Okay. And you can go look at it, but they distract us and they let us watch TVs and we have our phones. And oh, by the way, why are you coming after cows? Why don't you go after lawnmowers? We burn 800 million gallons of gas a year in lawnmowers. We're spilling more gas each year on the ground than the Exxon Valdez. Oh, but NASA says that lawns are a net carbon sink. You can go right on their website. I document it. Why? Because they don't include all of the fossil fuels used and the lawnmowers, 5 million a year manufactured, the leaf blowers, the spilled fuel. They just look at a lawn that's mowed versus a lawn that isn't mowed. And that's what they do with cows, Jim. Just to close with
Yeah.
cows. I
Yeah.
defend my cows. It is
Yeah.
estimated
Tell
that
us about cows.
we could replace a third of the world's synthetic fertilizers with cow manures that right now and pig and chicken manures that are turned they throughout history from China on, this has been the foundation of growing plants. And now we're told that we need a plant diet. Well, artificial meats made from plants are going to, with Bill Gates, et cetera, are made from GMO monocultured plants. They're tainted with pesticides. It destroys the soil. It increases erosion. It's drawing down our aquifers. Cows eat solar panels. They're called grass. Okay. They're naturally regenerative. You don't have to put them in a landfill. But cows don't just burp and fart. Okay. To use the AOC thing. Everybody laughs about the cow farts. They poop and urinate. And that's how you feed soil. That's how you rebuild soils. That's how the bison built the Great Plains that we're destroying and getting all of our food from California, which is subsiding like 2 feet a year because of all the water being pumped out of the ground. And so ultimately, this is a push, whether for profit or control, to have the same actors who have destroyed the small farms in America destroy all the farms of the world. In fact, the WEF says that they need to get rid of the 500 million peasant farmers of the world because they're destroying the planet. They're destroying the Amazon forest. We need BASF and Bayer and Syngenta and
Yeah,
these
exactly.
companies. Literally, BASF, the chemical company, calls themselves sustainable. They're in Ukraine. They're in agriculture.
And
Bayer
Cargill,
Aspirin, you know,
AMD.
Cargill, all the JBS, they're all at the table called stakeholders. Funny names, stakeholders, STEAK. There are no farmers at that table. I don't see it. I see lots of industry people from Pfizer in our FDA. I don't see many farmers at the USDA. So we have non-farmers telling us how to farm, and that's what's destroyed our farms, made them unprofitable, made us sick for 100 years.
Yeah.
And I fight for my grandsons and my children and all of your grandsons and grandchildren to alert people that yes, they are coming for your food. Oh, and they have mRNA vaccines for chickens and cows too. Um, that's another rant.
Let's shift more to something personal about your journey. I I, I we're now in a situation where Trump is president of the United States. We had an election in which he decisively won in the swing states and nationally. The journey that you have taken, John, from being a Democrat and an Obama supporter to where you are today is the journey that many, many, many Americans have taken. And willy-nilly, for consequences that remain undetermined, we now have Donald Trump as president of the United States again. Please share with us some more details about your journey, because your journey has been, in some ways, America's journey. And I think it's important for us all to understand that. Because, again, as I've said all week, the COVID issue is not just an isolated issue sitting out here, it's a symptom of something pervasive. And as a farmer, as a lawyer, as a husband, you've lived out many of the contradictions that have caused you to undergo a metamorphosis in your political loyalties and perceptions. Tell us more about that story. It's important that we all
Well,
understand
oh,
it.
yeah, great. Thank you. I'm glad to. And by the way, I was a poli-sci major in college, and
I
so
was too. I was too.
and this is bipartisan, by the way. When George Bush invaded Iraq, there was no yellow cake uranium. That was all a lie for the neocons, and it was to serve Halliburton and other corporations to take it over. Donald Trump isn't about shifting from left to right. He's about shifting from the deep state or the corporatocracy to we the people again. There's one thing they fear, it's populism. Now, what I find intriguing about your question is that when Bernie Sanders was running, a lot of people supported Bernie Sanders, and then he sold out to the Democratic machine. In fact, the courts ruled that the Democratic machine didn't have to be Democrat. Democratic DNC could, put Hillary Clinton in. Now, uh, Bernie Sanders would have won in 2016, almost for sure, I think, over Donald Trump because Hillary Clinton
Oh,
was
yeah,
so unpopular.
that was
And so if
clear.
you look at this, if you're a poli sci guy and you look at this, you can go research, there's something called a Sanders Trump voter. I knew these people. They were Sanders people, far left. They went to Trump. Why? Because, and I wrote an article about this before the election, people wanted a populist. Sanders was a left-wing populist. Trump was a right-wing populist. Sanders sold out, fell on his sword, and said, yeah, make me Secretary of State. Give me the money. Classic socialist, right? Oh, yeah, we're going to help the poor people as long as I'm a millionaire and have 4 houses. And because that's what Bernie is now. He's just been shown to be a shill. Well, then you can also look up something called an Obama Trump supporter. People that supported Obama that then saw that he betrayed them. Thomas Frank, a very well-known liberal essayist, wrote his book Listen Liberal in 2017, which explains you can't run a party on we hate Trump. Sooner or later, you have to have policies. The Democrats we saw under Biden and Kamala Harris was a mafiosa, corrupt machine. Okay, that's what we saw. And now what we saw was Bobby Kennedy stand up to them. And I supported him early on. I went to see him in New Hampshire. I wrote articles about him nationally. I had to be careful because I have a Republican base. But when he stepped over, became MAHA, which, by the way, Make America Healthy Again, embraces the themes of my book. I think he may have read it. I gave it to him a long time ago, which says conservatives can lead on the environment by supporting regenerative agriculture and supporting farm. You'll sequester more carbon than all the EV cars and solar panels combined. You'll get rid of synthetic fertilizers, which are made from natural gas, which is also known as methane, which we're told is the big offense by cows. Also generates a lot of nitrous oxide, which is 290 times more potent than carbon dioxide, according to the EPA. Are you with me? Because I'm going quick to pack it all in. I don't know how we're doing for time. I think we're running
No,
out, but
well,
we're almost there. And
yeah,
what happened was Kennedy stood up, and the Democrats were like, "No, no, no, we have anointed Kamala Harris, and but we will not allow you, a Kennedy." Well, now we see Democrats who are against Make America Health Again. We see the people that would have been petitioning against the Vietnam War, petitioning for World War in Iraq, in Ukraine. This is right out of Orwell again. They
yeah.
are trolls. They are afraid. They will take the vaccines and they will attack people that are standing for liberty as misinformation, as liars, as conspiracy theorists, as domestic terrorists. No, a lot of Americans saw in Bobby Kennedy and the way he was maligned that it exposed the man behind the curtain. And they saw what was done to Trump. And now they understand that at least I want somebody who's going to tell me the truth. Even if he's crusty, even if he says some dumb things and he says, oh, did I say that? I shouldn't have said that, Trump said about Zelensky. Yeah, that's what I want. I want people that are human and admit when they make mistakes and do what is right and good. And I think more Americans are starting to see through the lies about vaccines, about food supplies, and about these politicians who say they're our friends, but they make tens of millions of dollars on $180,000 a year. It's time to find out why. And this is populism. The guillotines are being sharpened figuratively.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that, John, because I think all of us are perplexed at the inversion of values and priorities that is sort of taken over the United States of America over the last several decades, where the Democrats
And
stand,
the world, by the way, Europe as well.
yeah,
Go
that
ahead.
the traditional Democratic Party turned into its opposite. The Republicans turned into their opposite, the World Economic Forum and the globalists and so forth and so on, so that all the categories of cognition by which people thought they were experiencing a normal reality have been completely blown asunder. And you're an example of someone who's, because you're a free thinker, you've kind of gone from left to right to the middle, just trying to keep up with the integrity of your own and your own sense of what's real. And I think that is important for us all to take in, because we can't rely on the traditional civic institutions anymore. And I'm not so sure that Trump is going to be successful in the ways that you indicate, but I do think you represent the kind of personality transformation that brought him to power the second time. And I think that's really important, everyone. I'm noting in the chat that this is a controversial conversation, as it's turning out, not just on the vaccines, but on Donald Trump and the state of America. And we need to be able to talk about this in a broadcast like that. So I just want to thank you for being so disclosive.
Well, and I don't think I said that Trump was going to be a success. I just think that he is anathema to the powers that are controlling us, and people are distracted by these things about Gulf of Mexico versus Gulf of America. Why hasn't he brought down egg prices yet? I'm a big fan of Bobby Kennedy, and I'm a big fan of the people that are behind Donald Trump and Bobby Kennedy. It's not just about one person. That's what please read Thomas Frank's book, Listen Liberal. He is a Trump hater. And he will tell you why the Democrats have lost their way with the blue collar workers of America. Right there, 7 or 8 years ago, he told you on the left. Sorry, just
that's
adding because it's a
so
bipartisan. We should all be supporting healthier food for our children and more accountability for vaccines for our children. All of us. It is not a blue-red or a black-white or a rich-poor issue. That's the deception. That's how they divide us.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to form new alliances and new coalitions around the goals that we seek, rather than resting on, oh, I'm a Democrat and I don't like Republicans. That world is now gone.
I hope so.
And in some ways, I embrace that, because it allows all of us to be more fully who we are, and the interaction with our fellow citizens. So, John, thank you. This has been just scintillating. I love the acuity of your mind, my friend.
Well, I hope
You
so.
know a lot.
I felt intimidated following Mary Holland. She's a hard act to follow. She has so much knowledge. So I do want to contribute, and I hope somebody can take something away from this and go find out more. Nobody else is going to educate yourself. You have to question everything, especially in these times.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, my friend. Thank you, everyone. That'll bring us to a close for today. You can, I don't know, John, we didn't find out whether you could join the after chat for a few minutes. But if you can take on just a few more minutes, John.
Oh, and I should plug, can I plug my Substack? It's called Small Farm Republic. You can subscribe for free. I write about a lot of this stuff, and you can disagree with me all you want. I'm a free speech guy. I was when I was a Democrat, and I am as a Republican. I didn't change. Like Bobby Kennedy said, I didn't leave the party. It left me.
Yeah, exactly. I've been with Kennedy all the way through, and I support him. I think he's going to make he's a profile in courage.
He is.
Robert Kennedy Jr. is a profile of what his uncle talked about. He's a profile in courage, as you are, my friend, as you are. So,
well,
you can join John in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You all received the link in the Zoom reminder for today. But I want to just close everyone by just acknowledging the importance of what John has shared with us today. Not only about what's happening to our country and around the world, but the importance for all of us to think for ourselves, to question authority, because in the world in which we're entering, all our old assumptions, all the old categories of truth and value and meaning have been literally blown asunder, which means we have an extraordinary opportunity to create a new world with new friends and new partners, proportional to our ability to find out for ourselves what the truth is, and to move forward with the kind of courage that we have seen with every single speaker this week. Every single one of them has gone against the tide, has questioned authority, has had the courage to speak out, and has suffered thereby, but still stands. And that, to me, is the essence of democracy. So, John Klar, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you Monday. Bye for now.